Okay, we're beginning our Bible study on the paradox of happiness. Again, it's coming from Rene Bruehl's book, The Paradox of Happiness, Finding True Joy in a World of Counterfeits. Again, it's not my own material, but it's coming from his book. We're looking at chapter 2, The Spectrum of Possibilities. And this is part 2 of chapter 2. And so we've looked at the introduction. We looked at rejecting artificial happiness, that which the world calls happiness, and surrendering. We looked at surrendering to artificial happiness, how often people just end up surrendering to it, maybe in different forms, but it's still that artificial happiness. And so here we'll be looking at examples of individuals seeking artificial happiness or the happiness that the world seeks. These passages illustrate the biblical theme of humans seeking fulfillment apart from God. And that's where we would put our emphasis, and the futility and consequences of such pursuits. And so the first one, of course, is Genesis chapter 3, verses 1 to 7, where we see the fall of man. Adam and Eve eat the forbidden fruit, seeking wisdom and fulfillment, but apart from God's command. When the woman saw that the fruit of the tree was good for food, pleasing to the eyes, and desirable for gaining wisdom, we see three things here. And we go back to 1 John, where it says, love not the world, neither things in the world. It's, they're passing away, the lust of the eyes, the lust of the flesh, and the pride of life. So the lust of the eyes, the lust of the flesh, and the pride of life. We see all three of them here. So she took and she ate it. And then we see another aspect. She also gave some to her husband. Humans do not like to be in their sin alone. They want someone to join them. And so she gave to her husband who was with her, and he also ate. Then again in Genesis 11, 1 to 9, at the Tower of Babel, we see the same thing happening. People attempt to build a tower to the heavens. To what? To make a name for themselves, disregarding God's will. Right? So there again, a self-centered truth where they're trying to do something for themselves, and in doing that, they're disregarding what God wants. And they say this, come, let us build ourselves a city with a tower that reaches to the heavens, so that we may make a name for ourselves. Otherwise, we will be scattered over the face of the whole earth. And what's interesting here is in Genesis chapter 12 and 11, 12, and going forward, we see that God promises to make a name for Abraham. And so in 12, 1 to 3, we see the promises of the blessing. And before that, we see God promising to make that name for Abraham. Not Abraham making a name for himself. Ecclesiastes chapter 1, verses 2 and 3. Solomon reflects on the vanity of pursuing worldly achievements and pleasures without God. The vanity of Ecclesiastes, vanity of vanity, right? All is vanity. There's no hope for man alone. And Solomon was known as the most intelligent person who ever lived. And after he'd lived, and after he had all the beauty, and he had the most beautiful temple for God, and most beautiful temple for a house for himself, and he was so rich, people were always bringing him gifts because of his wisdom. And yet he can write the book of Ecclesiastes and say, vanity of vanity. Okay, and meaningless, right? Says the teacher. Utter meaningless, or vanity, says the teacher. Utter vanity. Everything is meaningless. What do people gain from all their labor and toil under the sun? And when it's done by people for themselves, the answer is nothing, right? At the end of the book of Ecclesiastes, it talks about fearing God, right? And then here we have Luke chapter 12, 16 to 21, and this is the parable of the rich fool. Jesus tells the parable about a rich man who hoards his wealth without, and there's the key word again, without regard for God. It says, but God said to him, you fool, this very night your life will be demanded from you. Then who will get what you have prepared for yourself? This is how it will be with whoever stores up things for themselves, but is not rich towards God. Okay, it's that which is done for God, that which we give to God. Not in the sense that we're giving him something that he doesn't already own or already belongs to him, but our mind isn't on ourselves, but rather on serving God. And then Romans 1:21 to 23, Paul describes how people turned away from God. They pursued their own desires, leading to idolatry and moral decline. What does he say? For although they knew God, they knew that there was a God. Really, if everyone was honest, there would be no such thing as an atheist, right? We're created to worship God. We all know there's a God. We all try to find something to put our faith in. And most of the time, if you listen closely enough to the atheist, he's putting his faith almost in an atheistic idea, but he's doing it to protect himself from the possibility that there is a God and that he is responsible to him. So they know there's a God. They do not glorify him as God, nor do they give thanks to him. But what? Their thinking becomes futile, and foolish hearts are darkened. Although they claim to be wise, they become fools. They exchange the glory of the immortal God for images made to look like mortal human beings, birds, animals, and reptiles. And the thing is that those who reject God and make idols, they make the idols like things that they know, right? And it's usually a form of a person or an animal, which is not greater than them. And not only that, it can't see, it can't speak, it has no emotions, and it can't control anything. It's an idol. Okay, so the underlying logic, these paths fail to achieve true happiness. Why? Because although they seem substantially different, okay, each of the illustrations are different in some ways, they undergird by one fundamental posture. Okay, they're undergirded by one truth, and that is self-centeredness. Not God-centered, but man-centered, and not just man-centered, but self-centered. We try to find happiness for ourselves, and we, even as believers, often find ourselves as being very self-centered. However one defines happiness, whether as skeptic, you don't believe what the world's presenting, whether consumerist, whether it's buying and getting things, or whether it's living in our minds in imaginary terms, the pursuit of satisfaction is always self-serving. Okay. It's always self-serving. We perform activities that we hope will make us happy. Right? We hope we'll be happy. So we do these, we lay them out, and we try to accomplish them, hoping that they will make us happy. This self-focused orientation is the fundamental logic behind our action, the default state of the human heart. It's what everybody does. Everybody is looking for happiness, but they're looking for happiness within. They're self-focused. They think if they can have their way, if they can get what they want, they'll be happy, but it never happens. It is an assumption so deeply ingrained in our minds that it is hard to imagine life in any other way. Okay? All of us have that. We're taught it. It's around us all the time. What makes us happy? Let's do what makes us happy. And it becomes very self-centered, and it's the way of life that we know. And we were made that way because of the fall, because of sin. Before the fall, Adam and Eve were happy. They had a perfect relationship with God. They would walk with him in the garden. They had a beautiful garden. They had a purpose for life. And they were not self-centered, but they were God-centered until they took of the fruit. How can someone live without having the well-being of the self as the goal, as the end goal, as what we're searching? How do we keep self from becoming the center of what we are doing? How can someone pursue happiness by a logic other than self-satisfaction? I mean, that's only logical, right? We want to be happy, then it has to have something to do with me. It has to have something to do that's self-focused, because I'm the one that wants to be happy. So therefore, it must be something that I'm gaining or something that I'm doing, and that's the logic of fallen man. But this connection is the essential assumption we have to untangle, get rid of, straighten out in Jesus' analysis. All right. Achieving happiness is not necessarily linked with the pursuit of happiness. Maybe we should say the achieving happiness is not linked with the pursuit of happiness, at least the pursuit of happiness of the world, right? It's just not linked to that. A satisfied self is not the immediate result of successful efforts to be satisfied. Okay, so if somebody wants to be satisfied, to be happy, to feel good, just being successful doesn't bring that. And we see it. Even if we're a student, we're successful in our classes, then we're happy, we get the report card, we're happy for a very short time, and it's gone. And then we're looking for something else. Always looking for that, whatever it is that would make us happy. Happiness is distinct from self-centeredness. If we are self-centered, we'll never be happy. Happiness is distinct from self-centeredness. In fact, the two concepts are opposite. We could draw it this way, right? One goes in one direction and the other goes in another direction. And that is why our common paths to happiness fail. Because they're always connected to self-centeredness. What will make us happy? And when we ask that question, the answer is always wrong unless God is in the picture. They spring from unfulfilled hearts trying to satisfy themselves. Okay? It comes back to themselves, right? We try to make ourselves happy. They run along the tracks of self-service. We do things for ourselves so that we can be happy. If we are to refine a different path to happiness, we can't just fashion a new definition of it. We can't just change the definition of happiness to become happy, right? We can't just give it a new definition, say, therefore, now I'm going to be happy because this is what it is. Or produce a novel milestone of a happy life. So we can't change what will make us happy if it's going to be self-centered, if it's going to be something on ourselves. We must investigate the very way we function, and we might add to that, in the very way we were made to function. Right? We must unearth the most basic dynamics of the heart. How did God create us, and what did he create us for? If the diagnosis is superficial, the remedy will be superficial as well. And this is usually where we are, right? We don't look deep enough. We always end up with self, where in reality we should end up with God. God should be the center. He should be the one that we are concerned to draw ourselves to know better, to walk with. Without that, it's very superficial. If we switch the search for consumer goods to inner tranquility, self-service may still be the governing logic under which we operate, right? So if we're looking for inner tranquility, self-service could still be the governing logic. Right? So we have to think it through very carefully. If we change our ambition of being a rock star to being a renowned physician, adulation may still be the things we're after. So, in other words, if I'm a rock star, I'm not really helping anybody, right? I'm becoming someone that people adore, somebody that people follow and get excited about and yell and scream, but I'm not helping. So instead of being a rock star, I'm going to be a physician where I can help people. Right? But in the end, I'm still looking for people to like me, for people to be happy for what I've done. I'm looking for people to make me happy by accepting what I've done. It won't matter how thoughtfully we engineer our definition of happiness or how creatively we conceive objects of interest. The root of unhappiness lies deeper in our self-oriented posture to life. So we can bring this all the way up here. If we're a renowned physician, it's still self-oriented posture of life. That doesn't mean it's wrong to be a doctor, okay? It doesn't mean it's wrong to be in a position that we can help. But if it's self-oriented posture to life, it will not bring happiness. Turned in on ourselves. This is an expression our author likes to use. He gets, excuse me, he gets it from some of the older authors. But basically, to be turned in on ourselves is to be self-centered. Basically, concerned about ourselves. The key observation behind Jesus' alternation for happiness is what we live, obviously, but importantly, for our own sake. So his observation is that we're living for ourselves. Excuse me. This is the rule we follow in our quest for happiness, the logic that runs our lives. How can we best satisfy self? We are, in other words, bent creatures, people turned in on ourselves, people who are self-centered. The self is the starting point of our actions. Okay, it's the starting point. Everything comes back to self. Its satisfaction is the end behind our pursuits. So satisfaction for self is what's behind it all. Therefore, happiness will never arrive. Martin Luther put it this way. He says, Scripture describes man as so turned in on himself that he uses not only his physical, but even his spiritual goods for his own purposes, and in all things seeks only himself. And if we're honest, so often you and I do the same thing. We're only concerned about self. He hurt me, therefore I get to. It always comes back to self. If you examine what you want to do, if you examine your anger, it comes back onto self. It's what was done to me. So we're self-oriented, and that needs to change. In a similar way, Augustine, another early church father, defines sin not as a substance, but as a perversion of the will bent aside from God towards lesser things. So our will is after lesser things, not God. He stated that this very preference of its own being and of the knowledge, enjoyment of things temporal to the one eternal good is what constitutes sin. We don't seek God, we seek what we want. We seek the temporal, that which is passing away and will not be here. It will all end. And in the end, we stand before God and we are either his children or we are not. Our happiness must come from God. To be clear, having a sense of self is not the issue. Wanting to enjoy life and be happy is not wrong. Okay? So it's not wrong to want to be happy, but that happiness, where that happiness comes is what's important. Rather, sin is characterized by this turned in on itself condition or self-centeredness. Okay? By a love of self so prevailing that it subordinates others' love and desires even for God to itself. So we love self rather than others. We love ourselves rather than God. Karl Barth described the human person as turned in upon himself and finding his satisfaction and comfort in his own ego, or again, in his own self-centeredness. The self is the focal point we gravitate towards, shaping our desires to align reality with our personal perspective. When we function in this way, we control relations to serve for our own purposes. In other words, everything we do and every person we are related to comes back for our own purpose. So our author says it this way: the liveliness of the world around us withers behind lenses able to distinguish only the shadow of self-interest. Okay, it always comes back to self. We distort our capacity to see and damage our ability to love, for our relationship with ourselves becomes so predominant. Okay, our relation with ourselves becomes so predominant that it absorbs other relations into its logic. Its logic is, the only way I can be happy is if I get what I want. And so relationships, right, become for us. We have relationships for them to meet our need. We chat briefly here. We voice a half-hearted prayer there. But in a meaningful, self-deep connection rarely occurs. So meaningful and soul-deep connection rarely occurs. We are only concerned about ourselves. We're still only concerned about ourselves. Because the self exerts such a gravitational pull, other good ends in life are pulled in to serve and build up self. So other things that can be very good, we end up using them to serve us and build up us. Right? We relate to God and to others for our own sake. Here's where the renewed mind needs to come in, that we find in Romans 12:2. Okay, there needs to be a change of our thinking so that we're not thinking self, 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 but rather God and others. For example, to love someone for the attention they give us, self-centered, right, is ultimately a love of attention itself. Mature love means loving the person and not just the attention they provide. So when Christ talks about true love in the book of 1 John, he talks about giving your life, right? A true friend gives his life. Much more than just looking for attention for ourselves. In the process, relationships may cease to be true relationships, again, because it's only for me. They may become components in our preoccupation with ourselves, not something to grow with, right? People are less often welcomed as individuals, as a conscious you with whom we connect as a valuable person, but instead are treated as an it, right? A component of our self-serving process. The individuals. We use people, all of us. And what we need to do is stop. We need to realize that we do it. We need to become aware of our sinfulness and ask God to open our eyes so that we're not using one another, so that we can truly love one another and meet one another's needs. Our relationship with ourself is so intense that it overshadows the attention we try to direct outward. Everything becomes inward. Everything becomes for us. In other words, sin turns us inward, self-centered, and severs us from others and from God. We need to, sometimes we say, well, yeah, but others, I don't really care for them. They make me angry, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But realize when people do that, when we are so self-centered that others irritate us, we're actually pushing God away, because God is asking us to reach and to help them, to serve them, to care about them, and not to be self-centered. Right? Change our thinking. It inflates our love of the self to the extreme of absorbing all of life into it or into our own self, rather to the extreme of diminishing all of life to the size of a starving self. Everything is self-related. The logic of self-love becomes the logic we live by. And this is what we need to be aware. And so as we go through the week, we need to say, why did I do that? Oh, I did it because I'm selfish. Why did I have that thought? Oh, I had that thought because I'm selfish. I'm self-centered. And if we would start analyzing our life that way, we would realize the logic that we're living by is a logic of self-love. And it's not like just, you think, oh yeah, that's the way I am. That's the way we all are, right? And what we need to do is realize there needs to be a change, and we need to be willing to ask God to help us change. And as we change, our church will become stronger. Our body as one will become stronger, because our mind will be centered on God. We hunch ourselves inward, lose interest in what will not benefit us, rolling ourselves into a ball like a hedgehog with prickly spikes, as Karl Barth put it. It's only caring about self. We lose the wondrous sight of reality and relationships. Our satisfactions are restricted by our incurved egos. Our happiness is confined by our self-centered posture. And I think if we can all admit that's what we do, then we need to start looking at how do we change? What do we do? A forgotten alternative. There is another way to meet this need. And it is here out of a conscious look at self-centeredness that a third option emerges. Jesus' paradox of happiness. It is a vision of life so powerful that it can reshape the logic of our existence. It displaces the quest for happiness from the central throne, okay, from our central throne. It occupies in our minds, redirecting our thoughts and our affections to a new direction. Happiness is removed from its pedestal as the ultimate aim of existence. I am no longer living for my own happiness. It becomes a byproduct of correct orientation to life. So we're not saying we can't be happy, but it's going to be a byproduct. It's not what we're seeking for. We do not need to be slaves to the ideal of happiness, nor do we need to deny it, nor do we need to let it rule our imagination until it divides our personality. Okay, we're not going to be slaves. We're not going to deny it, nor is it going to rule us in our imagination, yet still miss happiness. If we do all of that, we're just going to miss it, right? There's a higher, truer, holier path. It emerges out of goodness. It embraces and transforms suffering. It's willing to suffer, and it is deliciously happy. That is God's way. And as we continue on, we'll see more of how you and I can become Christ-centered. And that Christ-centered, a byproduct of that, and the byproduct of loving one another, will be true happiness.